Have you ever wondered what it feels like to stare at the most powerful navy in the world and defy it with just 2 fighter jets? What if I told you that in the warm Caribbean waters, not too long ago, that exact moment unfolded? A pair of Venezuelan F-16 challenged a U.S. Navy warship, and for a few minutes, the entire balance of power in the region hung on the thin edge of a decision. It sounds impossible. It sounds reckless. Yet it happened. And if you listen closely, beyond the roar of engines and the silence of the sea, this is not just a story of politics or military might. It is a story of human hearts caught between pride, fear, and duty. The Caribbean is deceptive. To tourists, it is all turquoise water, palm trees, and soft breezes. But beneath that calm, it has always been a stage for tension. Pirates in the old days, Cold War shadows in the 20th century, and now a delicate dance between a struggling Venezuela and an America that patrols the seas as if they were its own backyard. On a humid afternoon, the horizon blurred between blue sea and blue sky. The U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Lassen, cut across the waters on what the Pentagon called a routine freedom of navigation patrol. The word routine was meant to calm, but every sailor on deck knew there was nothing routine about sailing this close to Venezuelan waters. Inside the steel hull, Commander Daniel Hayes studied his radar screen. He was a man in his 50s, his hair graying at the temples, the kind of officer who had seen combat but never spoke about it. His crew trusted him not because he barked orders, but because he carried himself with a calm steadiness, like a father who knew storms always passed. Yet that day, he sensed the sea was holding its breath. A sudden blip appeared on the radar. Then another, fast-moving, low altitude, Venezuelan F-16. "Contact bearing 040, closing fast," the radar operator said, his voice cracking just slightly. Hayes leaned forward. He had expected this. Caracas had been furious about U.S. ships patrolling near its coastline. The Maduro government had promised a show of strength, but few in Washington thought Venezuela would actually risk it. And yet, here they were. Miles away, cutting through the humid air, Captain Rafael Duarte gripped the stick of his F-16. He was 32, young for a squadron leader, with sharp eyes that once dreamed of flying air shows, not combat patrols. His jet vibrated as it sliced through the sky, and beneath him stretched the Caribbean he had grown up beside. A sea he loved, a sea his government told him was now threatened. "2 bogeys confirmed," Duarte's wingman said over the radio. "Target, U.S. destroyer." Duarte did not answer right away. His father's voice echoed in his mind. His father had been a fisherman, a man who taught him respect for the ocean. "The sea gives, the sea takes," he used to say. "Never forget, son, no one owns it." And yet here he was, ordered to show the Americans that these waters were Venezuelan. As the destroyer loomed larger below, Duarte felt his chest tighten. He knew the statistics. A U.S. Navy destroyer carried missiles, advanced radar, electronic warfare systems, and the training of sailors drilled to perfection. His F-16 was fast, agile, a proud machine from an earlier era, but against the steel giant below, it was like a hawk circling a mountain lion. On the destroyer's bridge, Hayes raised his binoculars. He could see the faint glimmer of sunlight bouncing off the F-16's wings. They were low, aggressive, unmistakably deliberate. The crew stiffened, waiting for his command. Should they power radar locks? Should they launch warning flares? Every option was on the table. But Hayes stayed still. His years had taught him that sometimes restraint was the sharpest weapon. He whispered, almost to himself, "Not today." Down in the Combat Information Center, the tension was electric. One wrong move, one nervous finger on a trigger, and the Caribbean would explode into headlines and funerals. Duarte's jet swooped closer, the shadow passing over the destroyer's deck. Sailors looked up, squinting, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A Venezuelan jet, this close, daring them to respond. For a moment, time froze. The Caribbean sun, the salt wind, the engines screaming above. Why would a young Venezuelan pilot risk this? Why would the commander of a U.S. warship hold his men back when he had every right to defend them? These are the questions that make this story more than just a military standoff. They turn it into a mirror, reflecting pride, desperation, courage, and restraint. Duarte's hands trembled. Not enough for his wingman to hear, but enough for him to feel. He thought of his wife, waiting back in Caracas, of his little boy who loved drawing airplanes. What would history remember? That he had stood up to America, or that he had provoked a war? Hayes lowered his binoculars. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. He remembered being a young officer during the First Gulf War, watching how quickly bravado could turn into blood. He thought of his own daughter, now in college, who once asked him, "Dad, do wars always start with someone wanting to look strong?" He never answered her then. But standing on the bridge now, he felt the weight of her question. The two jets circled, daring, taunting, yet never firing. The destroyer's guns tracked them quietly, ready but restrained. The world did not notice. No headlines screamed. Yet in that moment, in that suspended silence between sky and sea, history trembled. The first act of this story does not end with explosions or fire. It ends with questions. What drives a young pilot to risk his life against overwhelming odds? What teaches a seasoned commander that sometimes strength lies in not firing the first shot? And what does the Caribbean itself, eternal and silent, think of men who draw invisible lines across its endless blue? Sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones filled with noise, but the ones where silence speaks louder than cannons. And on that day, silence was the most dangerous sound of all. The silence did not last. In the Caribbean, silence is never permanent. It is broken by the cry of gulls, the hum of waves against steel, or the unsteady breath of men who know they are standing on the edge of something larger than themselves. On that day, silence gave way to the low growl of jet engines circling above the USS Lassen, a sound that tightened every sailor's chest and sharpened every glance on deck. Commander Daniel Hayes gripped the railing of the bridge, his eyes never leaving the sky. Years of discipline kept his face still, but his mind was anything but calm. He thought back to a lesson drilled into him as a young officer. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who outguns you. It is the one who feels he has nothing left to lose. Venezuela was bleeding from sanctions, isolation, and economic collapse, and men who carry the weight of desperation often fly the lowest, fastest, and closest. Far above, Captain Rafael Duarte steadied his breathing. His wingman's voice came through the headset, jittery, nervous. "Rafael, we're pushing it. They're locking radar on us. One twitch and they'll fire." Duarte kept his eyes on the destroyer below. Its long, gray body stretched like a steel predator, armed with weapons that could erase him from the sky before he even had time to say goodbye. And yet orders were orders. He was told to fly low, to make them sweat, to show the Americans that Venezuela was not a country to be ignored. But in the cockpit, alone with his thoughts, the bravado of politics vanished. He thought of his son, Mateo, only 6 years old, who loved to sit by the window and watch Rafael polish his boots before missions. The boy had once asked, "Papa, why do you fly so high?" Rafael had smiled then, ruffling his son's hair, and said, "Because from up there the world looks peaceful." Yet today, peace felt further away than ever. On the USS Lassen, the crew worked in controlled chaos. Sailors adjusted radar scopes, tracked the jets, and exchanged terse phrases that carried no hint of fear, only procedure. But in their eyes, there was a flicker of disbelief. Venezuelan jets challenging the United States Navy? It was like a sparrow darting at an eagle. And yet, the sparrow was real, and its talons were sharp enough to matter. Hayes walked back into the Combat Information Center. Screens glowed, numbers scrolled, the heartbeat of the ship pulsing in beeps and data. An ensign turned to him, eyes wide. "Sir, do we escalate?" Rules of engagement permit defensive action. Hayes's jaw tightened. He thought of the Gulf of Tonkin, of how wars had been ignited by moments exactly like this, by uncertainty, by pride, by miscalculation. He imagined the headline flashing across American television screens, U.S. destroyer fires on Venezuelan jets. He imagined the faces of Venezuelan families mourning pilots who never came home. He imagined a spiral that no one could control. "Hold fire," Hayes said. "We don't shoot unless they do." The words carried the weight of both restraint and defiance. It was not weakness. It was discipline. Yet Hayes knew discipline was fragile when adrenaline was high. Meanwhile, Duarte angled his jet lower, the ocean's reflection glinting off his canopy. His wingman cursed. "They'll take this as a provocation, Rafael." "This is madness." But Duarte's voice was quiet, almost detached. "It's not madness. It's a message." And yet, in his heart, he was not sure if the message was one of strength or of desperation. He had grown up believing in Venezuela's pride, in Bolivar's legacy, in the dream of sovereignty. But he had also grown up watching shortages, blackouts, neighbors leaving for Colombia and beyond. He knew what his government wanted to prove, but he also knew what ordinary Venezuelans wanted most: dignity, stability, a life without fear. Circling once more, he glanced at the destroyer's deck. He saw sailors frozen in place, their heads tilted upward. He saw the flash of binoculars, the glint of helmets, and for a brief second, he felt the strange intimacy of it all, men staring at each other across machines, across nations, across silence. None of them had asked for this, yet all of them were ready to carry its weight. Back on the bridge, Hayes lowered his binoculars again. He caught himself whispering something he hadn't said in years. A prayer. Not a long one. Just a plea that young men would not die today. He thought of his daughter's question again, about whether wars began with pride. And he realized that pride was in the air right now, thicker than the salt wind. Minutes stretched into hours. Each pass of the jets scraped nerves thinner. Each sweep of radar felt like a test of endurance. The crew of the Lassen kept their hands steady, but deep inside, every man and woman wondered if they were 1 second away from history's next explosion. And in the cockpit of his F-16, Rafael Duarte felt the same. His hands no longer trembled. They were steady now, but heavy. Heavy with the knowledge that his every move was being read, interpreted, weighed not just by the men below him, but by leaders in Caracas, Washington, and perhaps even Moscow. "Wingman, hold formation," he said finally. "We keep circling." "No closer." The words were a compromise, enough to obey orders, enough to stay alive. Yet as he said them, Duarte knew that in this fragile balance, one mistake could still shatter everything. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the Caribbean in gold. For tourists on distant beaches, it was a perfect evening. For sailors and pilots locked in this dance, it was a reminder that beauty and danger can exist in the same horizon. And so the question remained: how long could restraint hold? How long could silence last before someone, somewhere, decided to break it? Because silence is not peace. Silence is only borrowed time. The sun had dipped lower now, and the Caribbean sky carried streaks of orange and violet. The USS Lassen cut through the water like a blade, steady and unflinching, while above it the Venezuelan F-16s circled like hawks, unwilling to let prey escape. Each pass grew bolder, lower, closer, and with each pass, hearts tightened on both sides, knowing the distance between provocation and disaster was shrinking fast. Commander Daniel Hayes stood firm on the bridge. His face betrayed little, but his crew had served with him long enough to sense the storm beneath his calm. He was weighing every second, every signal, every twitch of the radar. The destroyer's guns tracked smoothly, following the jets, silent but coiled like snakes ready to strike. In the Combat Information Center, a petty officer's voice cracked through the tension. "Sir, one of the F-16s just made a lock-on attempt. Not full, just a partial sweep." The room froze. It was the kind of move that was more insult than threat, yet it had teeth. To paint a target, even briefly, was to remind them, "We can fire." "Maintain defensive posture," Hayes ordered. His tone was steady, but his mind raced. He remembered a fellow officer once telling him that modern war doesn't begin with missiles. It begins with misinterpretation. He thought of that as he stared out at the fading light, wondering if the pilot above understood how close he was to sparking a fire no one could put out. Up in the sky, Captain Rafael Duarte adjusted his throttle, feeling the vibration of his jet under his fingertips. He hadn't ordered the radar sweep. His wingman had done it, a nervous twitch of defiance. Duarte's teeth clenched. He switched to the internal channel. "Control yourself," he said sharply. "Do not push further." "But they need to know we're serious," his wingman shot back, his voice tight with adrenaline. "They already know," Duarte replied. And in that moment, he realized he was speaking as much to himself as to his comrade. The Americans below knew exactly what Venezuela was trying to say. The real question was whether either side had the strength to step back before the silence broke for good. The F-16s dipped lower, so close now that sailors on deck could see the pilots' helmets glinting in the sunset. Some of the younger sailors cursed under their breath. Others whispered prayers. One, a 20-year-old from Texas on his first deployment, muttered, "This is it. This is how it starts." Hayes heard him. He turned, his voice calm but carrying weight. "No, son. This is how it doesn't start. If we do our jobs." The words settled over the bridge, steadying nerves, but only just. For Duarte, the view below was surreal. He could see the destroyer's guns tracking him, silent but alive. He could see sailors pointing upward, frozen between awe and anger. And in their faces, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not hatred, not arrogance, but humanity. Young men, not so different from his own cadets back home. Men with families, with dreams, with lives they wanted to return to. For a moment, his chest ached with conflict. He remembered his father's weathered hands pulling fish from the nets, teaching him that the sea belonged to no man. He remembered his son's laughter, the way his boy shouted, "Vuela, Papa," when he watched jets streak overhead. And he remembered his oath to defend Venezuela's skies, even if it meant defying the strongest navy in the world. The radio crackled again. Caracas command was on the line. The voice was firm, unyielding. "Proceed with close pass. Demonstrate resolve." Duarte closed his eyes for half a second. Resolve, a word spoken easily by men in offices. But for him, resolve meant lives balanced on a blade. He banked his jet, dipping into a sharp pass directly over the USS Lassen's bow. The roar shook the deck, rattled coffee cups, sent hats flying. Sailors ducked instinctively, hands tightening on rifles and railings. For a split second, the sky was nothing but thunder and steel. On the bridge, Hayes felt the vibration in his bones. His officers looked to him, waiting. Should they flare? Should they lock? Should they fire? Hayes raised his hand. "Hold," One word, but it carried the weight of his entire career. He thought of his daughter again. Do wars always start with someone wanting to look strong? His answer came in his choice. Not today. The destroyer held. Its guns never barked, its missiles never flew, and that restraint, that discipline, was louder than any explosion. But Duarte's heart was racing now. He had obeyed Caracas. He had made the pass. Yet as he pulled up, watching the gray giant remain silent, he felt something shift inside him. The Americans hadn't flinched. They hadn't fired. They had endured his thunder with patience. And somehow, that unsettled him more than any retaliation could have. His wingman's voice came through again, filled with adrenaline. We showed them, Rafael. We proved we're not afraid. Duarte did not answer right away. He was staring at the horizon, where the sun was melting into the sea, painting everything in fire and gold. He whispered, almost to himself, or maybe they proved it. Because what is true strength? Is it in the roar of engines and the flash of steel? Or is it in the silence of men who choose not to strike, even when they can? As darkness crept across the Caribbean, the clash of wills did not end with explosions. It ended with something quieter, more dangerous. A mutual realization that pride and restraint were now locked in battle, and no one knew which would break first. Night gathers slowly in the Caribbean, as if the sea itself refuses to let go of the light. The last strands of gold gave way to a deepening blue, and with the darkness came the hush that follows thunder. The USS Lassen kept her pace, engines humming like a steady heartbeat, while the pair of Venezuelan F-16 traced dark arcs against the sky, their navigation lights flickering like restless stars. Somewhere in that twilight, the line between defiance and disaster thinned to a hair's breadth. Commander Daniel Hayes stood alone with his thoughts for a moment on the bridge wing, the warm air brushing his face. He could still feel the tremor of the low pass in his bones, a reminder of how close the day had come to tipping over the edge. He wasn't thinking about headlines or politics anymore. He was thinking about sons and daughters, and about the quiet gravity of choices that could never be undone. Behind him, the bridge moved with measured efficiency. Voices low, hands steady, the routine of discipline holding everything together like a net over turbulent water. Down in the Combat Information Center, the watch team tracked the circling jets, logging their headings, altitudes, and speeds with the precision of habit. A petty officer leaned in and whispered, not to be heard so much as to release pressure. Feels like we're all waiting for a door to open or a door to close. Another sailor nodded, eyes never leaving the screen. Or maybe for someone to find the handle. High above, Captain Rafael Duarte felt the weight of fatigue settle in his shoulders, the kind that comes when adrenaline burns away and leaves thought in its place. The cockpit had become a world of dim lights and quiet alarms, the soft hiss of oxygen, the muted chatter of radios. He had obeyed the order. He had demonstrated resolve. Yet the silence of the American warship below had thrown something back at him, something more complicated than fear and more humbling than rage. It made him feel seen and measured, not just as a threat, but as a man. Caracas' command came through again, clipped and formal. Maintain presence. You are to continue deterrence pattern. Do not disengage without direction, Duarte acknowledged, but the words hung in his ears like cold iron. He thought of his father under the dawn sky, mending nets, telling him that courage was sometimes a whisper rather than a shout. He thought of Mateo and the bedtime promise he had made last week. I will always come back. He had said it easily then. Now the words felt like a vow with edges. His wingman was quiet now, chastened by the moment. Rafael, fuel is trending. We should consider bingo calculations. Duarte checked his gauges. They weren't in danger yet, but the math had started to tighten. On patrols like this, fuel was more than fuel. It was time, and time was the one thing neither side could command. On the Lassen, Hayes was doing his own math. He knew the jets would eventually have to turn for home. He also knew that a nervous pass, a sudden malfunction, or a misread signal could still light a fuse. He stepped back into the bridge and spoke evenly, as if delivering a weather report. "We will hold course." No maneuver that could be read as a challenge. If they want to leave, let them leave with dignity. The word landed softly and firmly in the air. Dignity, an old-fashioned thing aboard a modern warship, yet exactly the right size for the moment. Fate, which had lingered all day like a shadow just out of sight, stepped forward in the most ordinary way. As Duarte rolled into another wide arc, a small warning blinked in amber on his panel. An electrical fluctuation, minor but persistent. He tapped the gauge. The light steadied, then pulsed again, a heartbeat out of rhythm. His training took over. He ran the checklist, kept his voice calm, and felt his wingman slide a little closer in protective instinct. "Minor electrical left bus," Duarte reported. "No immediate danger." It was the sort of thing a pilot could ignore for a while, but not forever. The calculus shifted. He was no longer just a symbol carving loops above a foreign deck. He was a pilot shepherding a machine with a complaint that might grow teeth. On the destroyer, the radar trace of one jet wobbled ever so slightly. A sensor tech called it out. "One of them's not flying as tight." The operations officer raised his brow. "Trouble?" Hayes didn't answer right away. He studied the sky, the lines of movement, the way intent writes itself into a pilot's hands. War makes people look for threats. Experience teaches them to look for needs. He took the comms handset and spoke with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "Broadcast on guard. Keep it plain." Short, professional. Within seconds, a calm American voice rolled into the night, broadcast on the open emergency frequency the whole sky could hear. "Venezuelan flight, this is United States Navy warship on your 2 o'clock low. We are maintaining present course and do not intend to escalate. If you require assistance or clearance to depart, state intentions." The words were simple, spare, and offered nothing and everything at once. Duarte heard them in his headset like a hand extended in the dark. Assistance, clearance to depart, state intentions. In a different story, those phrases could be traps. In this one, they sounded like bridges. He switched to his internal channel. "Wingman, we'll complete one more pass at standard separation, then we will depart to base." "Confirm." The response came back immediate. "Confirmed." He toggled the broader frequency, his English precise and unadorned. "United States warship, Venezuelan flight will execute final pass and depart. No further maneuver. No weapon intention." On the bridge of the Lassen, a soft exhale rippled through the crew, a release that no one allowed to become relief. Hayes kept his face still, but a gravity eased behind his eyes. "Very well," he said. "Track them. Let them go with professionalism." The final pass was different, because everyone knew it was the last. It was still deliberate, still military, still weighted with meaning. But the edges had softened. The jets kept a respectful height and angle, and the destroyer held her course like a pillar driven deep into the seabed. Sailors on deck watched in an almost reverent quiet, as if the sky and sea had agreed upon a truce that men were wise enough to honor. As Duarte banked for home, the amber light steadied and then went dark, the fault clearing itself like a cough swallowed in the throat. He felt his chest loosen. The horizon opened, the coastline a dark thread in the distance. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel defeated. He felt, for the first time that day, human in a way that had nothing to do with uniforms or flags. His wingman spoke, voice calmer now. We pulled it off. Duarte watched the warship shrink behind them, a small geometry on a grand canvas. We pulled something off, he said. Maybe not what we were sent to do. Maybe more. Back on the Lassen, night had settled fully. Stars pricked the darkness, and the sea whispered its timeless lullaby against the hull. Hayes returned to the bridge wing and let the wind thread through his hair. He thought of the question that had haunted him all afternoon, the one his daughter had asked years ago. Do wars always start with someone wanting to look strong? He found his answer in the quiet stern of a ship that had not fired, and in the tail lights of 2 jets that had chosen to go home. Strength, he decided, is not the noise of power. It is the quiet of restraint. It is the courage to hold a line without crossing it, to let a man keep his pride without stealing your own. It is the discipline to see the person inside the pilot, the father inside the commander, the shared fragility beneath the steel. The Caribbean returned to its ancient rhythm. The destroyer steamed on. The jets dwindled into dots and then memory. The radio went still. And in that moment, somewhere between a day's tension and a night's peace, both men, one on the bridge, one in the cockpit, felt the smallest, purest kind of victory. Not the kind that writes itself in banners, but the kind that allows a promise to a child to remain true. The door had not opened. The door had not closed. It had simply been left standing, unbroken for another day. Dawn in the Caribbean does not arrive all at once. It rises by degrees, as if the sea itself is learning to breathe again after a long night. The water shifts from black to ink blue to a gentle wash of gray. Then the first color appears, a shy pink along the edge of the world. By the time the sun finally lifts, it feels less like a spotlight and more like a promise. That morning, after the Venezuelan jets had vanished into the dark and the USS Lassen had held her line in silence, the promise was simple. Everyone had lived to see another day. Commander Daniel Hayes stood with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He did not drink it. He held it the way a man holds a memory he is not ready to set down. The ship moved with that steady rhythm only sailors understand, a conversation between steel and water older than any nation. Around him the crew rotated through their routines. New voices on watch, new eyes on radar, the same careful heartbeat. In the light, last night felt like a story told by the ocean during a storm. Except the scuffs on the deck and the quiet in the men said it had been real. He thought of the words he had chosen. Hold. Maintain course. Let them leave with dignity. He had spoken as a commander. But in the stillness he could admit he had also spoken as a father. Restraint looks like caution from far away. Up close it looks like courage. He understood that more fully now than at any moment in his career. He had not surrendered the ship. He had not surrendered American purpose. He had simply refused to surrender to the gravity of pride. He set the mug down and looked east. He tried to imagine the Venezuelan pilot somewhere beyond that horizon, a name without a face, and yet no longer a stranger. A man who had flown close enough to rattle plates and test nerves, and then had chosen to go home. Hayes wondered what had tipped that scale. An amber light on a panel, a memory of a child, a prayer he would never hear. Perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps the pilot had looked down at the deck and seen the same thing Hayes had seen when he looked up at the sky. Not enemies. People. That was the truth that had drifted like a signal through the noise. It had changed everything without changing anything at all. High above the coast, Captain Rafael Duarte leveled his F-16 for final approach. His landing the night before had been smooth and unremarkable, the kind of return that earns no handshake and deserves no ceremony. But the quiet after debrief had stayed with him. He had answered the questions: altitude, bearing, fuel, distance to target. He had given the numbers the way pilots do, precise and free of color. No one had asked what he had felt when the destroyer did not fire. No one had asked what it did to a man to be measured by an enemy and found human. Perhaps they had not asked because they already knew. He showered until the steam cleared the tremble in his bones. He wrote a single line in the small notebook he kept in his flight bag. The sea gives, and the sea takes. He had always liked the sound of that sentence. Now it felt like a map. The sea had given him the space to make a choice. It had taken nothing from him except certainty. That felt like a fair trade. When morning came, he drove to the small diner that opened before sunrise, the one his father had favored when fish were good and fuel was cheap. The owner recognized him the way small places recognize their own. He nodded and poured coffee without a question. Duarte sat by the window and watched the light creep into the streets. He thought of Caracas and of the long tangle of politics that had brought a young man in a fast jet within seconds of catastrophe. He did not curse the tangle. He did not bless it. He simply accepted that he would have to keep living inside it. A boy passed outside carrying a kite taller than he was, bright red paper, a tail made from cut cloth. The boy lifted the kite into the breeze and ran until the line drew taut and the paper snapped to attention against the sky. The sight should have been simple. It was not. Duarte followed the line with his eyes until it vanished into blue. He pictured the destroyer as a small geometry far below, and himself as a part of that sky. He pictured a hand on a binocular and another hand on a throttle, and the same thought passing through both men at once. Not today. Back on the ship, the after-action review moved with the clean tempo of experience. The questions were clear. The answers were tighter than the night had felt. There were no medals for a crisis avoided. Sailors know that their best work is often invisible. A few men slipped quiet jokes into the spaces between. The sound of low laughter rolled across the compartment like a tide returning. Hayes let it stand. Relief, when earned, is not indulgence. It is maintenance for the soul. He gave final notes and dismissed the crew. Then he asked for a moment alone on the bridge. He did not have a prayer prepared, so he borrowed an old one that had been passed by many mouths and bent by many accents. Peace where there can be peace. Strength where there must be strength. Mercy wherever a hand can reach it. He spoke it softly, with no audience but the sea. He took out his phone and typed a message that would cross time zones before his daughter woke. We had a hard day. No one was hurt. I am proud of my crew. Wear your jacket. It is colder than it looks. He hovered over the screen a second longer than he needed. Then he hit send and felt something inside him ease. In Venezuela, the day warmed. Duarte paid the check and stepped back into the thin gold of morning. He drove past the school where children were tracing letters and numbers that would one day spell out the limits and reach of their lives. He thought about the word resolve, as men used it in rooms with flags. He thought about what resolve had looked like at sunset over the Caribbean. It had not looked like a roar. It had looked like a decision to climb rather than dive. He believed that counted. He pulled into the base and parked by the hangar. He checked on the aircraft as a mechanic would check on a living thing after a fever. He ran his palm along the panel where the warning had flashed. It felt cool and ordinary. He thanked it anyway. Machines can be loyal in ways men forget to name. He slipped the notebook from his bag and added a second sentence under his first line. The sea belongs to no one. He closed the book and breathed until the air found a regular pace again. He felt older than yesterday, and exactly the same as he had always been. A man trying to do his work without losing his face or his heart. That afternoon, the news would run a small item that most people would scroll past. Naval presence continues in the Caribbean. A few readers would stop long enough to wonder if anyone had almost done something they would have regretted. The answer, tucked into the quiet of a ship and the cockpit of a plane, would be yes. Almost. Almost is a word worth honoring. None of this settled anything grand. The questions that had filled the horizon the day before still hung there. How close should a nation sail? How near should a jet pass? Where does pride become appetite? And where does protection become trespass? These questions do not vanish when dawn arrives. They wait for the next crew, the next pilot, the next wind. Yet something had shifted just enough to matter. 2 men had chosen to trust the strength of restraint. 2 crews had accepted that dignity could be a bridge and not a hostage. 2 nations, for one night, had allowed the sea to be wide enough for both. That is not a treaty or a triumph. It is a thread. Threads hold. Threads can be woven. By sunset, the sky would return to its blaze, and the sea would hold its face like a secret. Somewhere under that light, a warship would keep her pace, and a pair of jets would sleep with covers pulled tight over their wings. In the morning, there would be orders again, and maps again, and speeches again. But in the quiet under the noise, a single truth would hum the way a ship hums when it finds its water. Peace is not a trophy. Peace is a practice. Hayes finished his day with a walk along the starboard rail. Duarte finished his with a slow drive home that traced the coast. Both paused by water at dusk and stood as men do when they are trying to measure something that does not fit inside numbers. Both whispered the same word without planning it. Enough. Enough for today. Enough to go home. Enough to try again tomorrow. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how fragile peace can be and how much courage restraint requires, then let's keep the conversation alive. What do you believe is true strength? A show of power, or the choice to hold back when the world expects fire? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every story, every memory, every perspective you bring. And if you want more stories like this, real human journeys behind headlines of conflict, pride, and faith, make sure you subscribe. Together we can remind the world that even in moments of tension, dignity, and courage still matter. Hit the like button if you believe silence, sometimes, can be the loudest sound of all.